I'd like to welcome Dr. Stuart Needham to the podium. He's a former curator of the European Bronze Age, so we're staying with the Bronze Age, at the British Museum, and is now an independent researcher and honorary research fellow of, and he's coached me in this and I'm still going to get it wrong, Amgueddfa Cymru, close-ish. I hope. I probably won't get an invitation to Wales, which is the National Museum of Wales. So I'll hand you over to Stuart now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon, and that was a brave attempt. I still can't get my tongue around it. It's a great pleasure to honour George today. I knew George pretty well. We had common interests in the Bronze Age, and more specifically in Bronze Age metalwork. Funnily enough, I'm not talking about Bronze Age metalwork today. Now, despite George's his very wide-ranging researches, broad interests, I'm not sure, and perhaps Fiona and James will correct me on this if I'm wrong, I'm not sure he ever stepped foot in the Rother Region. One might well ask, what has the Rother Region got to do with the Boyne Valley? It's a region on the edge of Wessex and slipping into the dark forest of Anderida, Acher the Weald. What's that got to do with the Boyne Valley? Surely this really is beyond. Well, I can offer you two connections. Everyone here knows the phrase, the bend of the Boyne. It's become common parlance in prehistoric archaeology. But have you heard of the bend of the Rother? The Western Rother, flowing through the borderlands of Hampshire and Sussex, in fact makes a very decisive change in direction at Petersfield, from flowing south to flowing east. And at this bend lies the largest early Bronze Age barrow group in the region. It's on Petersfield Heath and comprises at least 28 barrows, though they're arrowed there. The Rother Valley is flanked by chalk uplands to the south and west, and equally high sandstone uplands to the north. The Weald is everything inside the chalk surround, and I've defined that here by a white line. I would have done. A complex, and the Weald is a complex of varied sandstones, mudstones, siltstones, and river terraces, and even a little limestone. The second connection is less prosaic. The common observance and marking out of solstices, seen most famously here at New Grange, its light box allowing a shaft of sunlight to pierce into the mound's heart at midwinter sunrise. Looking at this fabulous publication, Pathways to the Cosmos, I do wonder whether my paper is a few years too late. At Petersfield Heath, we're looking at a slightly later period, the early Bronze Age, and a rather different set of manifestations. Here, both solstice axes look significant, as we shall see. And it is one of several sites with solstitial alignments in this region. Moreover, some of these alignments are embedded in the emerging fieldscape that came to succeed the early Bronze Age barrowscape. So solstice alignments are the focus of my presentation today, but first a little background from the conclusions reached in the People of the Heath project, now fully published in this volume, plus a supplementary one. Thanks to systematic scrutiny of LiDAR data and equally systematic ground truthing, recorded brown barrows in the region increased phenomenally and now average around one site per kilometre square. This despite the fact that they are sparse in the inner Wealden part. This fairly high density is within the typical range for the southern counties of England. Sorry, I beg your pardon. There are a few limited areas with significantly higher densities, notably in Western Wessex, the famous areas, and the Isle of Thanet in Kent. But these exceptions must be set aside when trying to interpret the more general pattern of barrows in southern England in terms of economy, demography, and lifeways. Much has been said and written about ritual and sacred landscapes in the Neolithic to Early Bronze Age. At times, areas dense in monuments have been seen as special set-aside reserves. In parallel, a further influential concept initiated by Andrew Fleming linked uneven barrow density distributions to transhuman societies. There may be special cases here and there, but in general, these models of land use and cosmography pose problems. And certainly, for the Rother region, we felt the evidence was far more in favour of fairly small-scale and largely sedentary communities, as mapped here. The territories have been deduced from barrow distributions, allowing for patterns of survival and destruction, patterns in their aggregation and topographic siting, and other contemporary evidence, this all detailed in the volume. Since stock keeping, especially cattle, was probably a major part of the food economy, daily access to water was considered to be a vital factor. The yellow territories shown here are distinguished by a high proportion of enclosure barrows and generally rather small mound barrows, so they have a distinct character. And I've tentatively suggested this zone may have been occupied by a quite different social group, even, for example, at the ethnic level. Our sedentary model does not exclude the fair degree of personal mobility that is now well attested by isotope studies, nor does it exclude internal seasonal movement. This is in fact well illustrated by the strontian isotope measurements for the buried individuals at Petersfield Heath. They were not all eating food from the same ecosystem and may reflect diverse backgrounds on the varied geologies of the locality. Interestingly, none seem to have been eating plants purely or predominantly from the chalk. The red arrow here links two samples from the same individual, a possible female from Urn 3, Barrow 14, who had evidently moved between childhood and young adulthood. It's now widely accepted that there's some chronological overlap between round barrows and early field systems, but the great majority of the barrows were constructed in the early Bronze Age, while the field systems mainly start in the Middle Bronze Age and onwards. There's been much debate about the nature of this relatively swift transformation around the middle of the second millennium BC. One key correlation may be seen in the aggregated radiocarbon dates for carbonized plant remains collected by Stevens and Fuller, which shows a strong upturn in cereals in southern and central England coinciding with the growth in field systems. Earlier, during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic, there appears to have been a significant exploitation of hazelnuts, perhaps a proxy for a heavy reliance on wild resources more generally. However, for the main barrow building period, there are few dates for either of these plants, and most food may have come from animals. Barrows and fields seem to be two entirely separate phenomena. Barrows, usually clustered in groups, were for the burial of ancestral remains and other ritual purposes, while field systems are seemingly more concerned with food production and the necessities of everyday life. Yet barrow groups and field systems frequently occupy the same parts of the landscape. Barrows are respected in the sense that they were not obliterated when within the fields, but they ended up in varied positions in relation to the later imposed boundaries, some at the boundaries, some in the middle of the fields, others somewhere in between. The fields appear to have been laid out according to their own independent rubric. Yet it turns out that solstice alignments provide some pivotal links between barrows and fields. Starting with the barrow groups, solstice alignments are particularly well illustrated by the main cemetery of Petersfield Heath. At midwinter, the sun sets in a prominent notch in the chalk ridge, which we call the A3 notch. The line of view passing directly over the adjacent spring-fed marsh. The largest barrows, picked out in red, I hope you can see those, respect that alignment. At the beginning of the same day, the sun rises over a more distant notch in the same ridge. This notch is in itself unremarkable, but it is exactly where lies the impressive Devil's Jumps, a barrow group in which the three largest barrows also align on the northwest-southeast solstice. From the jumps, the midwinter sun would be seen rising over the sea, trees permitting. And this event could be signalled to people down in the valley who would not see the sunrise for another few minutes. Thus is formed the solstice saltire for Petersfield Heath, incorporating the Devil's Jumps, the A3 notch, and a barrow group at Broadway to the northwest. But these are not the only sites to mark the solstices. Linear cemeteries at Hayshot Down and Woolmer Pond line up on the two different alignments, although in the case of Hayshot Down, only half of the cemetery is well aligned. It's worth noting that there are very few linear cemeteries like these in the Rother region. Indeed, there is only one other that contains more than 6 barrows in linear formation. Somewhat different is the case of the group on Sutton Common. The barrows enclose a small dry valley that is aligned exactly on midwinter sunset, and that line runs right through the largest barrow at the apex in the northeast. Sorry, we haven't got that, have we? Didn't respond. There we go. A different manifestation, but equally clear, may be seen in the excavated ring ditch at Heath and Duncan. The grave is orientated on the northwest-southeast axis and was enclosed by an arrow-like mortuary structure which points to one end of a linear cemetery on a nearby ridge. The presumed body had decayed, but 3 arrowheads and other flints were present. In addition to the specific solstitial alignments, of which there are further examples I can't show today, it is significant that of 20 linear elements, that is, having 4 or more barrows in a straightish line, as many as 17 are oriented somewhere between sunrise and sunset arcs. Sorry, somewhere within the sunrise and sunset arcs, i.e. between the two solstice axes. So how are these cosmographical references amongst barrows relevant to the emergence of field systems? The fields in this region are only coaxial over limited areas. Often they are oriented perpendicularly to the local dry valley, and it's also clear that they expanded piecemeal over time. Some were almost certainly being used and modified in late Iron Age and Roman times, when true ploughs were able to create substantial lynchets, which survive incredibly well. So there is a long history of evolution and reuse. At first sight, it's hard to see much by way of a relationship between the barrowscapes and the overlying fieldscapes, but detailed analysis reveals some key connections. Here at Lynchbore Wood, the barrow group is circumferential. The area enclosed included the confluence of 3 small dry valleys. Such dry valleys were likely traditional routeways up onto the high chalk and thence down into the Rother Valley. Even over this small area, the fields vary a lot in shape and orientation. There is, however, a more organised block of fields in the east overlapping the barrow group. And within this block are just 2 strips that are more consistent in plan than any others. One leads northwest from the largest barrow of the group, the other runs into the middle of the group. Both are aligned on midwinter sunrise to the southeast, midsummer sunset to the northwest. Although subsequent field strips respect the same alignment in general, their layout quickly loses this regularity. An area a few kilometres to the west includes the Devil's Jumps already mentioned, so a solstice alignment is known already to have been marked out here in the early Bronze Age. Nearby are 2 other barrow groups, of Phyllis Wood and North Marden Down. The superimposed fields show a variety of patterns, and again there is little sense of a single plan. However, in the midst of this rather incoherent pattern is a small block of regular rectangular field strips on Phyllis Wood Down, lying between the 3 barrow groups. I suggest this is the starting point of the field system, partly due to the regularity, but also because it is again aligned on midwinter sunrise. Whether this core block of fields was laid out in the Middle Bronze Age or perhaps towards the end of the Early Bronze Age does not alter the fact that the earliest fields evidently needed to encapsulate the critical solstice axis embedded in the Devil's Jumps just 400 metres to the north. There's another possible early field block in this area, this one of different character. It occupies a small dry valley, the lower half of which points to midwinter sunset. There is a possible house platform in a position to look down the valley at this sunset. This axis may have been anticipated in the barrowscape by the actual group of Phyllis Wood, for this sits aside a solstice-aligned spur. Zooming in on these 2 field core blocks, I suggested in paler tone here, which would have been the next fields added. The Phyllis Wood Down field axis may have been defined using barrows on spurs to northwest and southeast. The barrows are 2.6 kilometres apart and would be intervisible if no trees stood in between. An observer on the northwest barrow near Telegraph House would be able to determine where this alignment crossed the intervening spur of Phyllis Wood Down. Other cases of small field blocks being aligned on midwinter sunrise are being identified by Sabina Stevenson in her PhD research ongoing, and I'm grateful to her for allowing me to show this example. A fairly large area of the Hayshot and Graffham Downs has a block of fields with a predominant west-northwest, east-southeast alignment, thus not solstitial. However, amongst the few deviating alignments are 2 blocks with the southwest-northeast solstice alignment. One is a half kilometre south of the Hayshot Barrow group, which I showed earlier to embody the same alignment. This barrow-field pairing recalls the spatial relationship we've just seen at the Devil's Jumps. The second block lies further east. Its axis could have been laid out using a pair of unusual dished barrows on the ridge crest to the northwest. Although prehistoric field systems are mainly seen on the chalk in our region, occasional examples are now being recognised on the sandstone uplands north of the River Rother. And at Gona Farm, the solstice connection is repeated. Here, a promontory juts west towards the Haslingborough stream. It has the most impressive barrow group on the Wealden side of the river. It was succeeded by a field system which was cultivated long enough to produce large lynchets on some boundaries. The system is not very regimented, boundaries being partly dictated by topography. Nevertheless, the core axis does not follow the axis of the promontory, but instead points to midwinter sunset. By coincidence or choice, the small valley alongside points to the same direction. It has permanent running water, and there are probable prehistoric house platforms still visible in the ground today to either side. So, various solstice alignments have been recognised in this small region, both in barrow groups shown here in white and in core field blocks in red. The recognition of intended solstice alignments in prehistoric monuments no longer comes as a surprise, and as others have argued, is not self-explanatory in terms of particular beliefs or objectives. The evidence I showed earlier for the distribution of orientations for linear elements tells us that the solstice alignments are only part of the story. They're the special cases at the limiting standstills of the sun for which we can have a high degree of confidence in their intentionality. Many other orientations in between may also have been significant to the barrow or field constructing communities, but are less capable of independent validation. Two things stand out from the evidence for alignments in the Rother region. One is the goodly number of them, such that we are beginning to see a lattice formed by the two solstice axes crisscrossing much of the region, a lattice that embraces prominent natural features as well as the made earthworks. The second is that the alignment evidence has for the first time allowed us to make a substantive connection between two utterly different earthwork categories. Despite the radical difference between barrowscapes and fieldscapes in terms of morphology, layout principles, and primary purpose, we've found there to be important aspects of continuity in this regional landscape. Frequently, there is a connection between an important barrow group and an early block of fields. Perhaps we can go a bit further and suggest that the core field blocks are actually contemporary with the main round barrow era. These provided the obvious springboard from which the extensive field systems later developed. This potential early dating has all sorts of implications. For example, the need for the ancestral protection of cereal growing plots. The wider evidence suggests a direct relationship between the subsequent growth of field systems and increasing cereal production. And in the process of expansion, any primary concern to follow solstitial alignments seems to have dissipated. Even before the early field plots were delineated on the ground, I suggest these are areas dense in barrows, whether on the uplands or on lower heathlands were well-utilised parts of the landscape and not just marginal reserves for the dead. In the volume, it is suggested that an overarching role of barrows was that they provided ancestral guardianship of the land, in which they oversaw a range of critical resources. Barrow grounds seen thus played a critical part in the occupation of the land in its fullest sense, and can, despite their entirely different character, be seen as ancestral to the age of fieldscapes. Thank you very much.